We're going to have to do something
Yes.
different. Yeah. Danny, can you hear me? No. Danny? Danny? No. Okay. Perhaps we could get a message to Danny and ask her to try and reconnect again. Danny? No, she's gone. All right, we must keep going. I'm sorry for that. William, perhaps I could address the first question to you. And just to say, we've got 7 questions to get through in an hour, so we'll be quite rigorous about, hopefully about timing, but I'll remind in case we're overrunning. Could you please tell us a bit about your views on how the UK government has approached alignment with the EU in practice, and some commentary on whether you think the approach that's been taken is effective in terms of being clear and consistent?
It's been a piecemeal approach, and there is no overarching public concept or theory or policy, indeed, which I think is applicable to the way the UK government has done it. So if we look in the end, apart from around 700 instruments in terms of the retained EU Law Revocation and Reform Act, basically the pre-existing EU law-derived regulatory book on traded goods is being retained. So there is no change in terms of what's happening there. There's a few examples where there are some differences. Obviously, very different approach has been taken in terms of financial services, where supported by the industry, pretty much, there has been a fair bit of divergence, active divergence, which the UK has already done through the Edinburgh reforms and others. There are some areas, however, where the UK has adopted measures quite similar to those which the EU has done in a few selected areas. And then, of course, we have some of the consequences, I think, of the change of policy on CE marking, somewhat incomplete though it is, not applicable to construction products, medical devices, and of course, a lot is hanging on the word indefinite, which ministers used to talk about the continued usage of CE marking in the UK internal market. But of course, that in itself really means a sort of soft alignment with EU rules, which are based upon international standards, but really does involve a kind of unspoken alignment with those rules as they will change as the years go on, in order to retain the benefits of having the usage of CE marking. So you have a sort of patchwork quilt of different approaches which is going on. The final element, I would say, is that there are some very important fundamental areas where we've not heard any view from the UK government about their plans. And the most pressing issues, I think, for business are around energy and carbon border taxes. So we have, in just a few weeks' time, the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism coming into force, being phased in. Reporting requirements will apply to UK companies and other third country exporters from the 1st of October in 6 areas for the moment, but then will spread to all areas covered by the EU's emissions trading scheme. So we do not have a sense at this point whether the UK government will seek to align the UK emissions trading scheme with that of the EU. Neither do we have a sense that the UK government will introduce its own CBAM. So if it does neither of these things, the likelihood would be that our British exporters would face significant additional costs by way of a fiscal charge in exporting certain goods into the EU. So this is a key area of policy where we have no sense thus far whether the UK government wants to align, wants to do its own thing. And again, it adds to this patchwork quilt approach that we've seen, but without an overarching theme or policy or design to it.
Thank you, William. Patchwork quilts can be quite attractive, but George, I wonder if in this case you think that would apply.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with everything William said. I mean, there's also nothing perhaps wrong in principle with having a patchwork quilt. But I mean, different types of regulation may well call for different types of policy response. But perhaps I sort of just set a couple of points of context. I mean, the legal position on this is just put it very broadly. Obviously, at the time of Brexit itself, or the time of the end of the transition period, the withdrawal agreement, EU Withdrawal Act kicked in, and essentially that preserved in aspect, in large parts of UK law, EU law as it stood as of the 31st of December 2020, with a few minor variations to make the system work when it was in a UK context rather than an EU context. There was also, of course, some fairly fundamental change at that point. For example, the abolition of the four freedoms, the abolition of the state aid rules in the UK. So there were some major changes, but in large areas, frozen in aspect. You then got, of course, the retained EU Law Act, which William made reference to, which in terms of the legislation that has been removed has turned out to be something of a damn squib, in that the legislation that's going to be positively removed is overwhelmingly, I think almost entirely, legislation that had exhausted its practical effect in any event. But there's also longer run features of rule, in particular wider powers given to ministers to change the retained EU law that sits in the statute book, and also what one might call sort of adjectival matters, but really quite important. Namely the sort of way in which one approaches EU law, the principles, the glasses through which one interprets it. We're all, as from the end of this year, will have to change, and quite what effect that will have on substantive content will remain to be seen. It depends how the courts you interpret these rules when they've been told to take off the EU law spectacles through which, up until now, they've been told to read these rules. And then, of course, you mustn't forget there's a whole set of other statutory powers the government has taken over the years since Brexit to diverge in specific areas. Agriculture, for example, an area with which I'm familiar, medicals and medical devices. So you've got specific acts of parliament that actually confer very wide powers on the government to regulate. It's a typical pattern of these legislation. It's very broad powers being given to ministers to more or less regulate as they like. And what's interesting about the use of quite a lot of those powers in a number of areas, particularly medicines, which I know something about, is that those powers have scarcely been used in practice, so that the regime remains very much as it was when we left the EU, very little in the way of substantive change. So that's a sort of legal background. Another point which is really relevant to alignment in goods, which one must also remember, is that in Northern Ireland, EU law still continues to apply with more or less full force in relation to goods, with some adjustments via the Windsor framework. And one of the impacts that has, when one thinks, obviously it has impacts in Northern Ireland, but in Great Britain, one of the impacts that has is that in practice, it makes it it's a pressure to maintain alignment, because if the government wishes to avoid regulatory borders down the Irish Sea in the way of Northern Ireland to UK goods trade, you've effectively got to accept, because you're not going to check any goods products coming in from Northern Ireland. And that means effectively that you've got to accept that goods that meet EU regulatory standards are always going to be lawfully sold in Great Britain. And that's a major regulatory constraint, which is going to continue for the foreseeable future. So that's also something I think that needs to be borne in mind. I think I'd like to say something at due course about different types of divergence, because I think that also matters, because it also matters in terms of the way you think about different types of alignment. But perhaps we'll come on to that later.
I think we will, George. Thank you very much for that. And Danny, you're back. And can you hear?
Yeah.
Are the problems resolved?
I think so. So far, seems good.
Thank goodness.
Fingers
I'm
crossed.
glad. George, just very quickly introduce yourself, because you were silent previously.
Yes, sorry. Yes, so I'm Danny Lochran. I'm the Managing Director of Aston Chemicals. We're a small, medium-sized company in the southeast of England. We also have a base in Poland. We import chemical ingredients for personal care products from all around the world into the UK and Poland, and supply them to manufacturers from huge multinationals to tiny one-man bands all across Europe. So we have quite a lot of experience with the chemical regulations, EU REACH, and now the plans for UK REACH. And I can talk endlessly about those if you want me to.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm now going to move on to our second question. And Philippa, could you please put it?
Thank you. Thanks very much. Peter, if I could ask George, Danny, and then William, what challenges have been faced by UK businesses due to the current approach that you've described to regulatory alignment with the EU? And if this kind of piecemeal, not aligning, not dynamically aligning, sometimes diverging, if that continues, what do you think are the key challenges if we have that approach going forward? Starting with yourself, George.
Yes. I mean, I think there are sort of two, if I put it, there's two separate issues that I could focus on. One is any difference in the rule book as between the EU and the UK, obviously in itself imposes costs of certain kinds. If you're devising a service package or trying to sell the same goods across Europe geographically, i.e. both in the UK and in Great Britain, Northern Ireland being a slight special case, there are enormous advantages in having the same rules applicable and not having, for example, to get two sets of legal advice, to devise two sets of manufacturing processes or two sets of processes for checking for the way in which you supply services to different clients. And therefore, there is a virtue in itself in having the same rules applicable in the EU and the UK, in that it reduces the costs of doing business in the UK and makes it easier for businesses, either American businesses or businesses in the EU, to sell their goods and services in Great Britain, because they don't have to do anything differently from the way they do it in the EU. So that's one second issue.
I assume that also is a benefit to UK businesses who export to the EU.
And it's a benefit for UK. Exactly. If they know that they're compliant with the UK rule book, and they know the UK rule book is the same as the EU, that makes it easier for them. So that's one advantage. Although one also has to remember that it's good for us to get imports. It's good for us that EU businesses wish to supply stuff to the UK and to do so easily, because we might want it. It might be cheaper than stuff that we would otherwise get. So there are advantages both ways. So that's one advantage, of course, but that in itself doesn't stop the issue of regulatory checks at the border. That's another set of potential advantages of having the same rule book, is that you no longer need regulatory checks at the border, because either side of the border the same rules apply. So a widget that is in circulation on the market in the UK could, in principle, wouldn't need to have checks. And that's the sort of second aspect of alignment that is much more difficult for the UK to achieve unilaterally. And I suppose that brings me on to a point I was going to make about there being different types of divergence that one needs to think about here. But perhaps I'll deal with that later, because I've got just other people who need to answer that question. But I think the advantages of alignment are those twofold: same rule book, and if you can arrange it with the EU, a minimization of checks and processes when crossing the border.
Okay, Danny, obviously chemicals very impacted by this just briefly, because we've slipped a bit in time.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, so very briefly, I mean, the first question was about how the UK government has approached alignment in practice at the moment. And I'd say there's huge uncertainty. We really don't know what is happening. We gaily left ECHA and the EU REACH system of chemical regulation. The UK said they were going to place it with UK REACH, but there were really no guidelines on what that was going to look like, how it was going to work, when it was going to happen. There have been huge changes since then in the timings of it, so we don't actually know when the deadline is going to be. It has been pushed back, but that is good in a way, because it means we're not trying to implement a poorly defined system yet, which is going to cost a lot of time and money when it does happen. But it means that the threat of that future massive change is still hanging over us, and because nobody knows exactly what it's going to involve and how much it's going to cost, that's just a massive amount of risk that only applies to UK businesses. So it's a unique disadvantage to UK manufacturers and a disincentive to to someone investing in the UK or manufacturing in the UK. The UK plans for UK REACH really are a total unique disadvantage to us. So an extra cost, bureaucracy, risk, uncertainty that's hanging over the UK that isn't over the EU at all. So for anyone outside the US or a Chinese company or whoever wanting to make something in Europe, it used to make a lot of sense to manufacture in the UK and for the whole of Europe, and then just export what you needed for the other countries. And we were seen as a very good place to do business. Now that's completely stopped. It's the other way around. It makes much more sense to make your Europe-wide products in the EU somewhere and just import into the UK what you need for the UK, which is really bad for UK manufacturing. We've seen massive contracts leave the UK because of this. So that's just a brief thing about that. And then what we've got at the moment is at least a kind of halfway house, a transition period. We don't have to have the full UK REACH registration because nobody knows what that's going to look like. And we're still consulting with DEFRA and their advisors on how it could work. Their most recent proposals were completely unworkable, impractical and expensive. So they've gone away to look at them again and are supposed to be submitting a new proposal at the end of September or October. But at the moment, the system we have is that we have downstream user import notification system. So if you've been selling something in the UK previously, you can continue to do so. That kind of works. But we are having to manage two systems because the UK is a relatively small market. Manufacturers in the UK do need to sell into Europe. It is our biggest and closest market. We really can't get away with that. So anyone using chemicals in the UK, those chemicals really have to still be EU REACH registered. And that work's already been done. We already have all that. We've spent billions of dollars, pounds, yen, whatever, getting those registrations done. And so that's not going to go away. So UK businesses are always going to have to manage two systems. Hugely expensive, again, just a disadvantage for anyone manufacturing in the UK. The idea of the two systems diverging even further and those two systems being more different is just more work, more complexity, and more disincentive to anyone wanting to manufacture in the UK. And we really, I mean, maybe there's a chance to say this later, but I think we need to act urgently on this. Business is hemorrhaging from our customers.
Can I just ask you something the public would be interested in? With the construction of UK REACH, and obviously some of these registrations belonging to European companies, could that have to involve further animal testing to prove something that we already know?
Yes, I know. I mean, obviously, animal testing is something very sensitive. The UK consumer were the first ones in the world, really, to say this isn't right. We shouldn't be doing this. So UK consumers hate animal testing, and we really did lead the world in that.
We have to do more to create UK REACH. That's all.
At the moment, we think that's a massive threat. I think everyone managing this is very careful to say there's other methods. We'll try and stay away from animal testing. But the reality is the EU REACH registrations killed millions of animals. They did require animal testing to get the level of safety data that was not required. As things stand, I don't think there are alternative methods to replicate all of that data. So it would mean, apart from the costs, I mean, the costs were huge. And again, they would only apply.
Shocking.
They would. And it's unnecessary. It's all been done before. That data is all there.
Yeah. William, just ask if you've anything to add to what George or Danny have said that they haven't covered, because we are slipping behind.
Sure, Philippa. I mean, in terms of just direct answers to the question, if we continue with the current approach, it is simply going to be more costly and more difficult for UK companies, particularly in goods, to do the trade they want to do with their customers in the EU. CBAM, when that is fully implemented, will add to that burden. We're looking at the EU's ambitious schedule of trade policy changes it's looking to make over starting in the autumn. So corporate responsibility on supply chains obligations are likely to become incumbent on third country exporters as well. So we can see that continuing with this current approach that the UK government had is simply going to see costs rise and export opportunities become reduced.
Okay, thanks very much. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Philippa. Thanks, everyone. Alan, over to you for question 3, and obviously let's watch the time.
Indeed. So I think between you've sort of answered the first part of this question, which is, what's the difference between having alignment where we just do it ad hoc and doing it as part of an EU agreement? And if I've misunderstood that the latter is preferable, please put me right. I'd like to ask about sort of an extension of EU agreement. What about a generalized policy that the UK would generally align, a default alignment, and only with exceptions? Is that a workable approach at all? Danny, why don't I start with you?
From my perspective, that sounds great. Yes, what we'd really like is for there to be a level playing field for UK manufacturers with our EU competition. And that really means none of this extra bureaucracy, work and cost and animal testing potentially. So yes, a default alignment where we just follow what EU REACH is doing and what ECHA are doing would be great. I think ECHA also has the people. They have, I think, over 500 people and a very large budget. We don't have that. We're trying to replicate the same amount of work, actually all over again from scratch, with a fraction of the resources. I would actually say it's just not workable. It's just not, I can't see how it's actually going to happen, sadly. So yes, but from our perspective, the simplest, easiest and cheapest way of doing things, it was definitely the best. We were part of ECHA. We were instrumental in setting up ECHA and establishing EU REACH. We know the UK has had a huge influence on chemical regulations across Europe. We know that system worked very well. Being part of it and not having to do any additional work and cost would be by far the best arrangement for the chemical industry and manufacturing.
Super, thank you. William, briefly.
Yeah, I mean, alignment by default, which might well be where we're kind of heading to over the next few years. It would certainly give business a lot more certainty. It would certainly, make things predictable and, offer a sort of reasonable sort of landing spot. But of course, let's remember that, it's possible for any country outside the EU to align with the substance of single market rules. But you're not within what Michel Barnier has called in the past the ecosystem of the single market. And so you're not party to the decisions, the tertiary legislation being made by EU regulators in a number of fields. So we may find that it certainly mitigates potentially sharply rising business costs with trading with the EU in the future. But it doesn't take us back to where we had before the start of 2021. So there are, I think, limitations on what it can achieve for business. I would see it as more of a sort of mitigatory mechanism to ensure that we don't have the potentially disastrous effects of sharply increasing export costs, but neither can it take us back a sort of unilateral alignment mechanism cannot take us back to where we were in 2021.
Thank you very much. George.
Yeah, I mean, I think my answer is going to overlap a bit with question 4, because I think that the link on institutional mechanisms, because I think that the issues are linked up. I mean, when there's thinking of alignment about default, one's got to think about various aspects of what that means. One obvious thing that it means is that you don't deliberately legislate in a way that departs from the EU law that we've already inherited. And that's, in a sense, relatively easy to do. You just don't diverge deliberately. Another aspect is much more difficult, which is you've also got to move with the EU, because the EU itself is moving. It's not frozen in aspect. The law is not frozen in aspect as it was in December 2020. On one level, that's relatively straightforward, and that you can track what the EU is legislating and just put it into your own system. Although you need a proper set of statutory powers in order to deal with that, which in some areas you have, medicines, because the government can do more or less anything it likes there by secondary legislation. In other areas, it's more difficult. There's however, a third issue, which creates, I think, a number of legal and institutional difficulties and issues. And that is what one might call the problem of creeping divergence and avoiding that. And William's already alluded to this a bit. The thing is, you could have exactly the same rule book in the sense that exactly the same legal text as legislation, but you can have practical divergence because the courts, for example, the courts are interpreting those texts in different ways. In the EU system, that's dealt with by the role of the Commission as enforcing body and the role of the European Court as the ultimate arbiter of EU law and its ability under the system of preliminary rulings to adjudicate on disputes arising in national courts and to reach a common view, which then applies across the EU automatically because of the binding effect of CJEU judgments in the EU system. You've also got, and on a less legalistic level, but also in practice very important, in the EU system, the regulators all talk to each other, the Commission issues guidance. There's a lot of sort of soft discussion going on, not so hard-edged, but common guidance. The French regulator may discuss a problem with the Commission and with the German regulator and reach a common view. This all happens in all sorts of weekly, monthly, annual meetings between the different regulators. The UK is out, absent agreement outside all of that. So there's even if your rule book ends up looking exactly the same, you may in the end find that in practice, the regulation is different, either because the courts have applied it differently or the regulators have applied it differently, or you don't have quite the same guidance on each side of the channel. So if you're wanting a system of reliable alignment, you've got to address that institutional difficulty as well, which probably would almost inevitably involve some agreement with the EU at some level, and there are various different things you could do. I mean, one thing, for example, you could do would be if by agreement with the EU and you wanted to align, say, in medicines, to take an example at random, you could say in this area, the UK courts would be bound by CJEU case law. We would not only copy the legislation, but our courts would have power to make references. The Commission would have enforcement powers, and like the EEA countries, we would have a role in the perhaps probably a consultative role, but the consultative role can be quite important in the formulation of that law. So that's the sort of very highest level of alignment you can probably have while not being a member of the EU yourself.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very useful. Alison might want to sort of bank that answer as part of the answer to question 4 to catch up.
Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed, everyone.
Yeah, I think that's right. Let's go, Alison.
Yeah, thank you. So question 4 is what would be the legal, institutional and political issues with maintaining regulatory alignment, and can these be overcome? So George, you've obviously gone into this topic already. Is there anything you want to add, or shall I move on to our other witnesses?
No, I mean, if you wanted the sort of institution, the sort of highest level of alignment, then you would need an agreement with the EU. And it is, and because of the reasons I've outlined as to why, even if you follow the same text, the rules and practice might differ. That is precisely why the EU is not in, it's no use saying to the EU, do not check our goods because, hey, look at this text, it's exactly the same as the EU text. The EU will inevitably say, that is not good enough. If we're to be satisfied that these goods, these services have been manufactured, processed, whatever, in compliance with EU law requirements, it isn't good enough just to have the same text. We need to be sure your courts are interpreting the same way. We need to be sure your regulators are following the same guidance. You need, in that sense, to be in the EU system. So it's got that at that level. In order to remove the regulatory checks, you're going to have an agreement with the EU.
Thank you. I'll go to William, please.
Yes, I mean, if you're going to have a sort of bilateral regulatory alignment mechanism, which is underpinned by a treaty, then you've got to deal with the issues about how regulators will interact with each other. I mean, the TCA involves an element of regulatory cooperation, and that's possible, but cooperation is not the same as the type of contact that would be required if you're going to have a sort of meaningful alignment that doesn't just mitigate future business costs, but takes, almost in a sense, takes you back to where you were pre 2020. Different ways that the EU has, with others, chosen to do it. You've got the European Economic Area, where you have the role of the EFTA court. You've got the arrangements with Switzerland, which are quite unique. EU perhaps finds them somewhat troublesome at times, but they've nevertheless proven quite durable. And then also there are the more limited arrangements with Turkey as well. So there's this customs union and related bits of alignment around that. But, that raises the issue for people in the UK about how far they're prepared to go in terms of having some kind of judicial mechanism that, in a sense, restores part of the primacy of EU law over domestic law. And that is, at present, a tough call for policymakers to make.
Thank you. Danny, anything to add from your industry?
Well, this obviously isn't my area, the politics and law of it, but I guess from the chemicals point of view, I think the ideal solution for us would be to negotiate entry to the European Chemicals Agency, and so that would require oversight of the ECJ. And the other thing about that is whether the EU would need to be persuaded to actually let us do this, because at the moment they have all the data already. EU businesses are doing very well out of the current situation. A lot of our manufacturing has moved into the EU, so they might come under lobbying pressure from their own industries saying, don't let them back. They decided to go. Tough luck. So I don't know whether that would be difficult or not, but just something that if I was one of them, I would probably be saying that.
Thank you. Back to Chair.
That was a rather depressing set of answers, I have to say. But anyway, let's move on, Jeff, please.
Peter, thank you very much. Good morning. One of the recommendations we have made is the creation of a UK-EU Regulatory Cooperation Council. From my perspective, and this is a slightly loaded question, how do you think such a joint council might enable the UK to have some agency in its regulatory negotiations with the EU? George, you mentioned on a couple of areas in particular to do with industries. Would you like to start from there?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to see that is anything other than a good idea, that it's always sensible to talk about regulatory matters. I mean, to take another area which I practice, the area of competition law, an area where effectively we've inherited sort of basic structures of EU competition law, but now have a system where our courts and so on can interpret it as they see fit. But in an area like competition, there's, for example, a lot of benefit from both sides in having a lot of regulatory cooperation, because you've got issues like cross-Europe mergers, Microsoft Activision being a particular example recently, but this happens all the time, where it's obviously very sensible for the regulators to be talking to each other to reach the same views and to make sure, for example, they don't create unnecessary burdens by asking the merging companies and other businesses concerned to provide the same sets of information to both sides, or even worse, slightly different sets of information to both regulators. So you sort of minimize costs and burdens and swap information and make sure the companies aren't telling each regulator slightly different things, and all these things where regulatory cooperation is very beneficial. And for the whole sets of other areas where regulation, particularly where you're thinking about investigation, where it's extremely sensible for regulators to be talking to each other to make sure that the investigations on both sides are as effective and as cost effective as possible. So that's a very good idea. In terms of what it would actually achieve for the UK in terms of the problems we're talking about, would depend on the extent to which problems I've identified have been addressed, and to what extent I think the UK effectively signs up for the institutional and judicial mechanisms that are necessary to ensure that when it aligns, it really does align with the EU. I think that's the important question. As to whether the EU is interested in the UK regulatory views, in some areas, again, medicines is an example, but chemicals, which I know less about, may well be another one. The medicines, the MHRA, the UK Medicines Regulatory Agency, was a very respected agency within the EU system. You see, it did an awful lot of work, as it happens, for the European Medicines Agency, and not just because the EMA used to be located just down the road in Canary Wharf, but just generally because the MHRA is a really good regulatory authority with a lot of expertise. I'm sure at one level the EU would welcome having the MHRA back in the system, enable more cooperation than is currently possible. And there may be, I'm sure there are other areas across the regulatory scheme, but also the point Danny was making earlier about it, unfortunately, the current regulatory problems hitting the UK in some ways, to some extent, helps businesses on the other side of the channel, is I'm afraid true. And I think one of the reasons why any sort of proposal for real regulatory alignment is going to have to fit into a wider discussion about what the UK can offer the EU, which may be things in other areas, as well as the particular area we're talking about.
Thanks very much, George. Danny, we've touched on the chemical conversation a couple of times. All the indications at the moment is that Europe will not be able to initiate another iteration of REACH because of their own political cycle at the moment. From your perspective, how would a joint council add value to our regulatory negotiations within this area?
I guess it's difficult to say without knowing how that would actually work. And in all these conversations, we've had quite a lot with the advisors to DEFRA. The kind of, wouldn't it be great if we could, is different to can we actually, how would this actually work? Have we actually got the resources? Is there actually the willingness on both sides to do this? Is there something in it for the EU to actually talk to us about these kind of things? So obviously dialogue is really great. So I think it sounds like a good idea. I don't know enough to know, would it actually work? Is this actually going to be able to work? And from my perspective, I'm very much focused on chemicals. I think it might be quite tricky to get ECHA to talk to us and to actually allow us to negotiate entry again, if that was decided that was what the UK wanted to do. It seems very simple from my point of view that's obviously a great idea and the most streamlined, efficient and good thing for UK trade and industry. Sorry, I'm rambling there, but I don't really know how that would work. So
I think it's an interesting one because the reality is the more systems you have, the more resource you're going to have to put in to make them work and understand them as part of the conversation. Just to move on, William, I'd like to move the conversation on slightly. Looking at comparative examples of regulatory relationships, are there any good examples that the UK could learn from or provide a model for what Danny's just said? How do we do this?
Depends what you want to do, Jeff. I mean, there are obviously examples across the world. You look at that between Australia and New Zealand, where they have mutual recognition in terms of a lot of regulations on goods. Now, we know in the EU context, that wouldn't apply in the same way because it says that mutual recognition can only come when you're a member of the single market. So there's, but others in the past have sort of talked about the benefits of an Australia and New Zealand type regulatory approach. You look at what's developing under USMCA, the US Mexico Canada trade agreement, formerly known as NAFTA. And I mean, it does quite radical things in terms of regulating, the wages and conditions that, workers in each of the three parties to that agreement can be paid. So you can embed quite a bit of common standards, a really deep level playing field within those sorts of arrangements. You've got the sort of emerging process of what's happening within the African Union, which is interesting, and you're seeing barriers to trade fall within that continent. But I think in terms of specifically the EU, you come down to, is something on the Norway EEA model possible? Are you then, if it's not, looking at something that is kind of like the Swiss bilaterals model with the EU? And it's really sort of variants of that sort. I think my sense is the EU would take a lot of persuading that these would be in its interests. So by all means, a regulatory council can fit within the TCA framework, no problem with that. But if you want to have a deeper level of integration in order to reduce the trade barriers that our exporters are facing, then you come back to these major political, legal and institutional problems about some kind of preferential relationship with the EU on the models we've described.
And of course, the devil will always be in the detail. George, would you like to pick up that conversation about examples of regulatory relationships with the EU? I mean, are there things that we can delve into more deeply to learn from?
Well, the EU has a large variety of relationships with surrounding countries. So we've already mentioned the EEA, which is an obvious one. Switzerland, which is, of course, every time I mention Switzerland, one's always told that that's the EU doesn't really want to offer that to Switzerland anymore, let alone to anyone else. And that's partly because the Swiss arrangement is deficient in the institutional arrangements that I've mentioned. For example, Swiss courts, there's no mechanism for referring disputes in the Swiss courts to the CJEU. But there are also, and there's Turkey, there's also a variety of arrangements with the accession states, some of which, the accession to which is somewhat more down the line than others. There will almost certainly be a whole set of rather complicated arrangements with Ukraine, replacing the existing relation with Ukraine. One of the interesting things from the Ukraine agreement is anytime anyone tells you that it's impossible to split the four freedoms, you just point them at the Ukraine agreement, which cheerfully splits the four freedoms. There's no mobility. There's no free movement of people between the EU and Ukraine, largely because the EU didn't want it. But there is free movement of goods and services under the existing association agreement with Ukraine. So there's a wide variety. I mean, it seems to me that any deal the United Kingdom has is likely to be sui generis because the UK's relationship with the EU is sui generis, not just as a sort of rather larger and different country than several of the other countries with which the EU has agreements, but there's also, of course, our relationship with Ireland and with Northern Ireland. That means that always has to be thought about, and other factors as well. But I think you have a variety of models. The EEA has its, for example, you don't technically have the ECJ in this EU EEA system. You have the EFTA court. Maybe that we could use the EFTA court for various adjudicatory functions, and it would be much easier, for example, to put a British judge on the EFTA court when dealing with a UK matter than it would be to do that with the CJEU, where I think there would be enormous resistance to ever having a non-member state ever providing a judge. The EFTA court is a bit of an oddity anyway, and it might be much easier to get that accepted. And since the EU has accepted the EFTA court for the EEA member states, it couldn't really say that it was completely unacceptable for the UK. So there are various things one can learn on, but I don't think you're going to find a blueprint of some relationship that you already has and say, oh, well, that will work for the UK. It's not going to be like that.
George, thanks very much. Danny, from your perspective in your sector, something to add about models and how these relationships can work?
Yes, we do have some examples on a much lower level, not on the institutional level at all, but on a sort of case-by-case basis in our industry. So, for example, the UK CLP regulations, the regulations on the classification, labelling and packaging of substances and mixtures, which is about the safety of chemicals and other materials. The HSE is still using data from ECHA's Committee for Risk Assessment, the RAC, to make harmonised classifications for chemicals going through the EU process. And we now only have a specific UK process for chemicals that want to initiate their classification in the EU and the UK and not the EU. So in that example, we are really following what ECHA is doing and just using that in the UK, which seems to be working so far. It's now under the GB CLP regulation. And then the other example that we're aware of is the MHRA, which was announced at the budget, where I think Jeremy Hunt said, we're lucky with the MHRA to have one of the most respected drugs regulators in the world. And from 2024, they'll move to a different model, which will allow rapid near automatic sign-off for medicines and technologies already approved by trusted regulators in other parts of the world, such as the EU. So I would say if we're doing it for MHRA, surely we can do it for other areas too that have got such a huge impact on UK trade and industry and the well-being of our population.
Danny, thanks very much. Chair, back to you. I think the Joint Council of Regulatory Cooperation is a great idea. The question is how. Yeah,
the question is how. And it's not easy. Let's draw this session to a close, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning to all of our witnesses. Indeed, just to draw the session to a close and just try to capture sort of the key points, could I ask each of you just to state for us perhaps your top 3 recommendations that you think the UK government should take if it wants to have closer regulatory alignment with the European Union. And I'll start with you, Danny.
I think my first thing is to be realistic about what is doable. We've had a lot of proposals about chemical regulations that were completely impractical and unworkable. There was a lot of how hard can it be and why don't they just? And when you look at it, this is just not going to happen. These people are not going to share this confidential data. This is not going to happen on a day-to-day basis in factories around the UK. So we've actually got to look at the detail of what UK businesses are doing and how our current system is uniquely disadvantaging the UK against the EU, and do something actually sensible, actually look at the reality and the detail, and actually have people that understand the systems, look at them and try and find better ways forward, rather than doing lots of Excel spreadsheeting and thinking everything's possible. I mean, obviously, from my perspective, rejoining the EU takes all of these problems away, makes it all very streamlined, and we're back on a level playing field with our EU competitors. From a purely trade and industry point of view, I think that makes perfect sense. Our customers, I think, would love it. I understand there's a few political difficulties with that. If that's not possible, I guess the next one for it, rejoin the single market. Again, apparently that's quite problematic, but from this question we're talking about here, regulations, that is the most sensible and streamlined and efficient thing to do. Then if that's not possible, from my perspective in the chemicals, just negotiating entry to the European Chemicals Agency, and I guess doing that on a case-by-case basis around the different agencies. I'm sure it would cost us more overall and be more problematic than what we had before. But all the other proposals and systems that have been shared with us by the government so far are just unworkable. And they just put UK businesses at a disadvantage. We have a huge market on our doorstep. All of our competition are also there. They are just carrying on without us. And my worry is this is happening fast and nobody is moving fast enough in the UK. No one's taking this problem seriously enough. And we're just going to hemorrhage more and more manufacturing out of the UK and into the EU. We're already seeing it happening. Our customers are already struggling, making redundancies, closing factories. Boots have just announced they're going to close the factory in Nottingham after 170 years. That's not a good way to be going. And I think that's going to continue, unfortunately, unless we really fix these problems urgently.
Sure.
Danny, do you have a comment to make about Northern Ireland specifically in that context, because of its unique status within the two unions?
I think they're slightly jealous, but I'm afraid I don't really know much about Northern Ireland. I don't trade there, so I wouldn't want to say too much about that. But it sounds like the best of both worlds is what we used to have.
Yeah. I wasn't going to raise it too much out of self-interest, but yes, point well made. And also, Danny, yes, it's definitely a sliding scale in terms of the options open to us in that regard. Over to you, George, in terms of your concluding recommendations, and then William.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose my first recommendation really builds on what Dan has just been talking about. I think there are real dangers in the approach that's been adopted in some areas of effectively saying it's been done with CE mark, been done to some extent with medicines, of saying, well, whatever the EU has already approved, we will automatically, accept. It's inevitable to some extent, partly because of Northern Ireland, but the real danger with it is that you lose UK regulatory capacity because your regulatory agency just ceases ever to be approached by anybody, and therefore no longer has any real work to do because people just rely on their authorization they've obtained from Brussels effectively. So that's a real danger. And it will become a real danger if anything ever goes seriously wrong, because people will then ask, well, why was it that this drug or this chemical got approved, and who in the UK looked at this? And if the answer is nobody, that may not be regarded as very impressive when something has gone badly wrong. So I'm not sure that this approach, which the UK government has been doing, is ultimately sustainable in the long run. More positively, two recommendations. One is my final two recommendations. One is to accept that if you're going to align effectively, by which I mean get the benefits of effectively being in the single market, not having regulatory checks, and the EU accept that your good or the service is to be treated in the same way as an EU good or service, you've got to accept that the institutional consequences which go with that, which will be some form of CJEU type resolution, either that or the FD court possibly, role for the Commission, and so on. And that involves dropping the obsession with hoarding sovereignty, which has been the hallmark of the current government. I mean, as I sometimes call them, sovereignty misers. They hoard sovereignty, but are never prepared to spend it in order to achieve real benefits. You've got to drop that approach. And finally, and perhaps even more important, if you're going to seriously try and achieve that level of regulatory alignment in a large variety of areas without joining the single market, without, of course, joining the EU itself, you are asking a huge amount of the EU, and that has got, therefore, it seems to me, to be made. That request has got to be made in the context of a much wider offer to the EU about improving the relationship in the interests of both sides. It will include issues such as defence and security. It will include an offer of the ways that the UK can help in relation to the achievement of the EU's objectives of net zero, in the green transition, strategic autonomy. All these are areas where the UK actually has quite a lot to offer. And it seems to me that if we're going to get regulatory alignment of the sort that's going to help Danny's industry, it's going to need to be in the context of a much wider agreement covering all those areas.
I'm sorry, George, just to follow up very, very quickly. At some point, that type of arrangement of different bilateral arrangements comes very close to the Swiss arrangement, which I gather the European Union and the Swiss find is seriously suboptimal.
It doesn't. It could all be, and you could have it all in one consolidated document. Whether it's in one document or several doesn't really matter very much. I mean, the deepest problem with the Swiss agreement is that the Swiss are not, from an EU perspective, sufficiently integrated into the institutional enforcement mechanisms of EU law. For example, the role of the CJEU has no role. The Commission has no enforcement powers in Switzerland, and that from the EU perspective is distinctly suboptimal.
Yeah, thank you. William, you have the final word.
Thank you. I'll be very brief with these. In terms of what's doable in the next couple of years, we'd urge government to have a clear, consistent statement on regulatory alignment. The preference being to align in areas where traded goods are involved. We would urge at least the beginning of negotiations on an SPS agreement could take a good while. Would also help, I think, the situation in Northern Ireland and
Absolutely.
particularly the inbound border
Yep.
control stuff
Totally.
we have in Great Britain as well. So that would be a key priority. Regulatory Cooperation Council, we think, is critical. I'm really, in terms of business, lack of business awareness about what's going on in Brussels and how it will affect is massive. But also, I would say in SW1, there's a incredible lack of awareness about CBAM, the incoming VAT changes in 2025, and what difference that's going to make to UK businesses. So the council would help us immeasurably around that. And then the final one, need to go back to a point I made really at the start, we need to have a formal linkage between the UK and EU emissions trading schemes. And if there is going to be a UK CBAM, that there is formal linkage of that with the EU CBAM.
Thank you very much. And back to you, Chair.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, all three, Danny, George and William. That was extremely interesting, extremely daunting, but lots of good ideas that we will want to reflect in our further recommendations. Thank you very, very much indeed for coming this morning. And I'd like to welcome our three witnesses on our second topic, which is narrower than our first, but of very, very great importance, looking at labour mobility and specifically at the possibility of a reciprocal youth scheme between the EU and the UK. We've got an hour to cover this, 7 questions. I'd like to start with asking our witnesses very briefly to introduce themselves. Catherine, would you like to go first?
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Catherine Barnard. I'm Professor of EU Law and Employment Law at the University of Cambridge, and I'm also Senior Fellow in UK and a Changing Europe independent think tank on the UK's relationship with the EU.
Thank you, Catherine. Marley.
Hi, I'm Marley Morris, Associate Director for Migration, Trade and Communities at the think tank IPPR, Institute for Public Policy Research.
Thank you, Marley. And finally, Jonathan.
Jonathan Portis, Professor of Economics and Public Policy at King's College London, and also, like Catherine, Senior Fellow at UKIS.
Thank you. Philippa, can I turn to you, please, for our first question?
Thanks very much, Chair. Obviously, Brexit meant the loss of freedom of movement and particularly labour movement across Europe. So I'd like to ask our witnesses their view about the UK's approach to youth mobility. What agreements have been reached, and basically, are they working or not working? If I could start with you, Marley.
Of course. Yeah, I mean, since the UK's withdrawal from free movement, we've seen obviously a number of deals between the UK and non-EU countries to expand youth mobility. I mean, the most prominent have been Australia and New Zealand as part of those trade deals, and primarily they've been around extending the age for youth mobility schemes up from 30 to 35. In Australia's case, removing some of the specific work requirements. In New Zealand's case, extending the youth mobility from 2 years to 3 years and bringing up a higher cap on visas. We've also seen a deal between the UK and Canada to extend the scheme similarly. And finally, we've seen a deal with India, a specific deal for an Indian youth professional scheme ballot with 3,000 places, which is seen as an olive branch for India as part of the ongoing trade negotiations. So primarily the deals have been with countries outside the EU and EEA. The one exception is there has been a deal with Iceland on youth mobility, which again kind of mirrors the deals that have been negotiated elsewhere in terms of extending the offer to 18 to 13-year-olds for I think 2 or 3 years. So I think so far the UK's focus has been outside of the EU. It just seems that despite efforts by the government, they haven't been able to make much progress on negotiations within the EU and EEA to secure those agreements, other than, as I said, Iceland. I think in terms of the deals so far, it's still pretty early days. They've only just been negotiated, and they're only just coming into play. And obviously we've had COVID, so the numbers have been lower in any case, and so we're only kind of getting back to normal with those schemes. It's worth saying in terms of the latest data for the first half of 2023 that the majority of youth mobility entry clearance visas coming to the UK, the majority were from Australia and New Zealand, and that's really where the bulk of people are arriving at the moment. If we look at Iceland, where there has been a deal, really the take up is absolutely tiny at the moment, tiny numbers. Really only a handful of people have come so far. So I think this reflects really that the nature of youth mobility will vary quite a lot depending on the countries that the UK is negotiating with, and obviously there'll be different levels of demand, but depending on the country. But yeah, I think so far it's still very early days in the scheme, and we kind of need to see more really from what the UK strategy is to negotiate with EU and EEA countries to get further deals.
Catherine, obviously it's not the focus of our discussion today, but obviously we lost Erasmus, which saw school exchanges, etc. Do you think the loss of cultural exchanges will also impact on whether people are interested in coming to the UK if they haven't had the opportunity? And of course, we've actually heard school parties having real difficulties with getting visas and bringing young people from Europe to the UK.
I think that's right. I think we can all say that some of our earliest experiences of a European or other country was through a school trip, and the particular issue with school parties coming from France or Spain or wherever is that they all have to have passports, whereas they're used to travelling on ID cards. And if there is a child in the class that comes from a country that requires a visa, so I don't know, there's a child in the class from Ghana, for example, then they've got to wait. They won't go unless that child can get a visa. And so all of this makes it more complicated. So that is at the school level. And of course, at the school level, if they're coming from EU states, they can come in under the rules that say you can come in as a tourist for 90 days out of 180. But on the specific point that Marley was making, of which, of course, I absolutely agree, just a couple of other additional points that's worth bearing in mind, because this is so different from free movement, is that yes, there are these schemes, but of course you've got to pay for them. You've got to have a visa, the clue's in the title. You've got to go through a process, and there are quite strict requirements, including the fact you've got to have a certain minimum amount in savings. Currently it's about 2,500, but the cost is not to be sniffed at. The cost for coming in, so the application fee is £259, but in addition there is the healthcare surcharge, which is £470 a year. So if you're here for 2 years, that's £940. And then there's one or two schemes that allow you to extend for another year. So of course that would be adding another £470 to the cost. So that shouldn't be disregarded. And then just
and that cost is going up, isn't it, to over the £750?
Yeah. And of course, the smallest country that we have just entered an agreement with is Andorra, which is nice, but of course it's not Spain, which is where there would be much greater interest.
Okay, thank you. And to yourself, Jonathan. I mean, particularly the industries that are struggling, that have tended to rely on young people coming, such as tourism and entertainment and so on.
So, I mean, I thought that was a very good roundup from Marley of what's happened. I mean, I guess the point I would make is that these new youth mobility schemes are not about labour mobility to any substantial. They're not designed to address labour shortages, and the government has no intention of using them as a key lever in addressing labour shortages. So I think we need, if we're talking about this issue, we need to separate out the reason for the rationale for schemes like this. Are we talking about it to promote cultural interchange, to promote the exchange of young people, leading to the exchange of ideas, leading to these lifelong connections, which might in some cases lead to some degree of labor mobility at some point? Or are we talking about specifically addressing the needs of the labor market? These schemes at present are not designed to do that. That is not the policy intent, and doesn't appear to be on the agenda for the foreseeable future. I could talk about where we actually are with the labor market and labor shortages. Perhaps you want me to say that for future questions.
Well, no, I mean, just with regards to these, why, if a young person up to the age of 30, 35 can come for 2 or 3 years in certain sectors, so not long-term careers, but things that tend to naturally have quite a lot of churn, such as tourism, why does that not help that sector? Because that's often people only came for 1 or 2 years anyway.
Because they're relatively small numbers. It's not the purpose of the scheme. It might help a bit around the edges, but I do not think it makes particular sense for certain sectors to go to the government and say, we're having a labor shortage, therefore what you need to do is to radically expand, either in terms of numbers or scope, a scheme that is primarily about, as I say, cultural interchange for young people and young people to be able to travel. That's not why those schemes are there. On the broader labor shortages point, I mean, I do keep on making this point, but it does get it through in the country. We have largely replaced the workers we've lost from within the EU with workers from outside the EU, even in accommodation and hospitality, say, which is the sector that has been complained the most. I have the numbers before me on my screen. We have fully made up the loss of European origin workers with new workers from outside the EU relative to before the pandemic. And we've more than made it up across the economy as a whole.
I wonder whether, certainly in tourism and hospitality here in Scotland, particularly in rural Scotland, we're still seeing very acute problems. Restaurants, hotels that are only open a few days a week because they simply can't get kitchen staff, chefs, serving staff. So it may be that they're coming in the numbers, but maybe they're still in London in the southeast and not actually reaching everywhere, because that's the feedback we're getting here in Scotland, literally hotels and restaurants that cannot provide a service.
I mean, that may be the case, and there may be specific areas, but it's hard to see that, even if you had a youth mobility scheme, that would be that hammer would crack that particular nut.
Well, I think the rural parts, the islands and highlands, were actually always very popular with Europeans. I mean, we have quite a lot of European citizens that settled in Scotland, including my husband. But particularly, they're often attracted by the wilderness and so on, Central Europeans, Dutch, German, etc. And certainly they still seem to be struggling. I mean, obviously, colleagues will explore the idea of European youth mobility schemes with individual European countries. But starting and working backwards, Jonathan, do you think looking at the TCA kind of re-discussions in about 18 months' time, that could be a win-win on both sides? The mobility of creative industries, etc. All of these things have had a huge impact. Do you think that's an area the UK government should start to think about and explore, even across the chamber on a cross-party basis, thinking about going back into the TCA review?
My personal view is you need to separate out 3 different things. One is short-term mobility for business purposes, that touring musicians and business visits and all the rest of it. That's about short-term labor mobility for business purposes, for people who basically already have a job or are picking up a short time. And there, I think there are clearly frictions and barriers where it would be of substantial advantage to the UK if we could streamline that There is every reason to do that as part of the negotiations about the TCA. Those are very much part of what a modern trade agreement looks like. They were left out of the TCA because of largely the incompetence of our government or whatever. And I think so. That is point one. Second point is, do we want a much broader youth mobility scheme which addresses the bit barriers which Catherine raised, about visas, charges, fees, and so on, because we think we are culturally part of Europe and part of maintaining those cultural social links. And this is not an economic argument, at least not in the short term, is about having something that is much easier, whether it's for 15-year-olds or 20-year-olds, whatever, so that people can just come and go without these barriers. That I think is something that would be, in some ways, there's a lot to be said for it. It's not primarily about economics or labor mobility. I'm not sure it's something that rightly falls within the TCA as before, instead of something that is more broad about rebuilding our historic, social, and cultural and political connection with Europe. And then third, there's about labor shortages in particular issues, where I am afraid I'm sort of with the government, which is actually, look, we've left the EU, and as long as we're outside the political structures of the EU, then we actually should not be discriminating. We shouldn't be treating Bangladeshis and Bulgarians differently. We've gone for this non-discriminatory system. Actually, it's not a bad system. It has the advantages of transparency, non-discrimination, fairness in that sense. It's not working too badly. You can address particular labor shortages within it if you want to, and sectors have to make that case at the same time as the government has to take an overall view of whether you want to complicate the system more by making those perceptions. So that would be my sort of overall strategic approach.
Okay, to yourself, Catherine, you mentioned passports, and I think there's an underestimation here in the UK of how many people in Europe don't have passports. My German family travel on ID cards and are talking about the hassle of now coming to Scotland because they might have to get a passport.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And of course, you can travel within the EU on an ID card. Now, I understand the government's concerns about ID cards, but in fact, Spain, which is the country I know best, they have gone for a very sophisticated set of ID cards now. And certainly, you would think that particularly for school groups, where the school have a very close tab on how many people are coming in and hopefully going out at the same time, you would absolutely think that ID cards would be quite sufficient, because the chances of something going badly wrong are minuscule in comparison to the disincentive of all the kids in the class having to get a passport to come to the UK for a week's trip. And again, I think just building on some things that Jonathan was saying, the loss of soft power and influence by not allowing kids to come and see the Houses of Parliament and Holyrood and so forth is really damaging long term. And I think as a bare minimum, that's the least we could do, particularly for school trips where the school absolutely knows how many people are coming in and going out.
Thank you. And yourself, Marlene. Just about whether this is something the UK should be trying to put on the table, a kind of wider topic of mobility when the TCA comes up.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely worth doing. I mean, this might come on later, but obviously in the kind of original version of the EU's sort of proposed draft agreement of the TCA, or draft proposal of the TCA back, I think, in March 2020, there were some provisions in there on youth mobility that were quite sort of broadly defined. I think it would be worth kind of considering that again in future. There's a kind of broader question, I guess, of to what extent that there's going to be opportunity to revise the TCA, and to what extent that that upcoming discussion will be a kind of a practical operational one, to what extent it will really allow for a reopening of negotiations. But if there are opportunities to kind of make substantive changes in future, I think absolutely thinking about the mobility chapter that the UK didn't want to include at the time, and looking at how to kind of think about youth mobility in that context would be important. I'm sure we'll come on to this later, but I think there's probably also a role for kind of individual bilateral negotiations with member states, given the kind of the complexities of competence in this area. But yeah, I definitely agree. There were a few points I was keen to kind of come in on, but I don't know whether we're going to return to them. Are we moving on from kind of questions?
Colleagues will explore the kind of bilateral individuals agreements in detail. So if it relates to that, we're going to move on to that. But if it's kind of in relation to the question I asked about approaching it in the TCA.
It was more kind of about the kind of what the potential benefits might be, I guess, of youth mobility.
I think there'll be lots of time to express that, but I think they'll come on to that. So thank you all. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Philippa. Alison, over to you.
Thank you. What challenges have employers faced as a result of changing youth mobility landscape? What are the business priorities for new visa and mobility schemes? So I guess kind of picking up on some of the comments that we've made or heard already around some of the impact on particular industries. Marley, can we start with you, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think just to start with, I think I'd agree with what Jonathan said earlier, which is that clearly we've had major changes to migration policy in the last few years, which has led to significant reductions in EU migration, but of course at the same time major increases in non-EU migration and net migration of around 600,000 in the latest statistics. I think that's kind of it's quite difficult to tease out all the different impacts, particularly given the kind of the broader impact of COVID on reducing net migration around the same time as the UK left the EU. But the broad pattern suggests, of course, there's been very significant increases in work visas, particularly in health and social care. And there've been, and largely that's been from non-EU citizens. There have been relatively low take-up of EU citizens of those visas, and relatively low take-up of visas in particular industries where EU citizens were previously working, so hospitality and food manufacturing. And that's because the nature of the skilled work visa makes it very difficult for people to be recruited into those jobs because of the skills threshold and the salary thresholds attached to those visas. However, and this was where I think Jonathan made the point just before, to some extent, many of those shortages have been filled by some of the recent schemes that are very flexible and that do not require sponsorship. So obviously we've had the B&O visa for Hong Kongers, we've had the Ukraine schemes where very large numbers of people have arrived in the last couple of years with no restrictions on their work rights. And it looks like, Jonathan was saying, from the HMRC data that largely those groups have replaced effectively EU citizens in those different sectors. I think in terms of where the key challenges are, it comes down to, this links to what Catherine was saying, a lot of the complexity and cost of the skilled worker visa and the other schemes. Although I appreciate Catherine's point that the youth mobility visa has its own challenges because it requires people to have certain savings and to pay the immigration health surcharge and so on. They are relatively flexible compared to some of the other schemes because they do not require sponsorship, and there are no sponsorship fees for employers. So in particular, think about small businesses. It's a lot easier for them to recruit people from people on the youth mobility visa compared to on the skilled worker visa. So there's some degree of flexibility, also probably a less risk of exploitation of people on those visas because individuals have flexibility to move between jobs and are attached to their employer as part of their visa requirements. So I think there's an argument that could be made, which is that to some extent the youth mobility visa could help to address some of the challenges that businesses are highlighting in relation to the current points-based system.
Thank you. Catherine, would you like to?
Thank you. Yes, I'd just like to make 2 points. Obviously, if we're talking about youth mobility in the technical sense, as this is about cultural exchange rather so much than employment of young people. So although at the margins it might help. But in respect of youth mobility, bringing young people in, for example, working in universities, what we're seeing, and this is where I wear my employer hat as opposed to my academic hat, my employer hat is that the visa costs are already causing real headaches because they are vast, and they still come as a great shock to individuals, and it comes as an even greater shock that the university will not pay their visa fees. They will loan the money up to £8,000, but the university won't pay the fees. And so they are looking to all sorts of other options in the Cambridge context to see if the colleges will plug the gap. So the costs are a real problem. And the second point I want to make in terms of, again, bringing young people in non-skilled sectors, I've been doing a lot of work in Great Yarmouth with EU migrant workers who came largely pre-2016, but quite a lot of them, Bulgarians and Romanians, came pre-2020. They were brought in very quickly in anticipation of free movement being turned off. And the exploitation that is going on with this group is alarming. And what we're also seeing in Great Yarmouth, and of course by the very nature of it, it's undocumented, is quite a lot of people coming in from those countries, coming in as tourists, being brought in by unlicensed agencies to get them to work in poultry factories and on farms, being told that they'll have the right to stay when of course they absolutely do not. They apply for certificates of application which actually allow them to work pending a decision on whether they get settled status, but of course they won't get settled or pre-settled status because they came after the deadline. And so I think there's quite a lot of illegal migration, illegal work going on in these places. And certainly when we talked to one of the large legal agents, and the very fact that they talked to us showed that they were not worried about what they were doing, they confirmed that what we'd been hearing as well. So the fact that there is a turning off of low-skilled people doing these jobs, which are really grim, leads to quite a lot of problems down the line. And the absence of a proper labour inspectorate means that we're not seeing what's really going on.
Thank you. Jonathan, anything to add?
I just echo what Catherine has said about visa costs being excessive, and that actually being a growing problem, and the planned new rise in visa costs, and that is actually going to propose significant problems for some employers in some sectors. So in terms of priorities on making things better, I'd say to try and stop making things worse. I'd also echo Catherine's second point about and this, of course, goes much broader than Great Yarmouth or particular subsectors, but just in general, the UK has a reasonably good legal framework on for labour market protection, exploitation, and so on, and absolutely terrible lack of enforcement. Luckily, most employers, of course, in most businesses are responsible and abide by the law without having to be put in, being threatened by it. Otherwise, things would be truly horrible. But there is, of course, a minority who don't, and frankly, at the moment, they are getting away with it.
Yeah, and would you agree, Catherine, it's the enforcement that's the real problem here?
It's absolutely dire. I mean, there is no labour inspectorate in the country. There is the GLAA, the Gang Masters Licensing and Abuse Authority. They are chronically underfunded. There is one GLAA inspector in East Anglia who can't possibly get round all of the relevant sectors, because remember, they're constrained by sector. They don't have a general inspectorate function, and they can only deal with agency workers. So if you've got directly employed staff in chicken factories, the GLAA won't touch them. Yes, the HSE has a role, and yes, local authorities have a role, but they have zero clout because they have got no money to actually have proper enforcement. So and these people do not go to employment tribunals. So all the stuff that we teach undergraduates about, you can go off to an employment tribunal and enforce your rights, of 6,000 cases that we have looked at in Great Yarmouth, there is not a single reference to employment tribunals.
Okay, thank you. That's very distressing. I'll go back to Chair. Thank you.
Yeah, it's very depressing. Alan, can I turn to you? It sort of builds a bit on what we've just been discussing.
Yes, indeed. I think in a sense you've answered a lot of what I was going to ask, but let me pose the question and sort of just please add rather than perhaps repeat. I mean, just I guess a sort of summary of what the potential opportunities for young people and for businesses of new youth mobility schemes would be, and I guess I'd include in that sort of upgraded ones. And in a sense, if there are lessons from our experience or indeed of other countries' experience about how, in a sense, what constitutes a good youth mobility scheme. Marley, you were wanting to talk about this. I don't know if you said your whole piece, but if you want to add, why don't I start with you?
Sure, thank you, Alan. Yeah, I mean, I think I touched on some of the points before, so I won't repeat them. I guess, I mean, I think Jonathan makes some fair points. Obviously, youth mobility schemes are not designed to kind of address some of the shortages that UK is currently facing, and indeed there's arguments that they shouldn't be designed to do that. They're designed for something else. I think it is worth highlighting though that the Migration Advisory Committee has on a number of times highlighted that if the government does want to kind of ease some of the pressures in the labour market, particularly in areas like hospitality, that there are particular advantages of using youth mobility schemes potentially to help do that. And there are a few potential reasons for that. One is that young people tend to be more likely to make a net fiscal contribution. So they're kind of the broader fiscal benefits. Secondly, as I mentioned, and kind of linking to the points about exploitation, the flexibility in the visa does, I think, reduce the risk of exploitation and broader undercutting. And so there's a case for having that. Obviously, the fact that it's temporary does create a risk potentially of exploitation, but the fact that you've got the ability to shift between jobs and you're not attached to a particular employer, I think helps significantly. It's also easier to administer for small businesses. I guess the challenge is, apart from the one I just mentioned about the kind of temporary nature of it, is that there are concerns over integration and the risk of a youth mobility schemes, and the key difference in a way between that and freedom of movement is that it's inherently temporary, and so there is some evidence, for instance, to suggest that communities can find it harder to manage and prefer longer term routes that allow people to settle rather than short term churn in their communities. And that can be difficult for people as well who might not have time to be able to learn language and settle and integrate into the workplace and into their local areas. So I think there are risks involved as well, but it's worth saying, I think there are the Migration Advice Committee, the MAC, has highlighted that there are particular advantages, particularly I think in sectors like hospitality, which are particularly attractive to young people.
Okay, thank you. Jonathan.
I mean, I think, I agree with what Marley has said. But I mean, I think, as I said, I mean, I think our focus when it comes to the labour market should be on getting the basic framework of the labour market scheme, work visa scheme right. And trying to shoehorn youth mobility into that rather than treating it as a separate objective in its own right, I think risks muddling objectives and getting things mixed up. Free movement was, one of the advantages of free movement was that it did everything at once. It allowed both a substantial degree of labor mobility, which worked well, and also had all these much broader social, economic, and political advantages. And, were we to rejoin the EU, no doubt those advantages would reappear, and I would be all for that. But I think trying to come up with some sort of, I do come back to the sort of view that given that we're out of the EU as a political institution, and by that I include the single market, I guess, because that is also fundamentally a political institution as well as economic one. Given that we're out of the single market, I think trying to sort of rebuild that aspect of it is unlikely to be optimal for the UK, and we so I do think that there was scope for, as I said before, trying to sort of have a much more expansive youth mobility scheme with Europe, but I would not put the labour market objectives of that front and centre at all. I would start off by saying we're doing this as part of an explicitly sort of social cultural project rather than as a labour market one.
Yeah, thank you very much. Catherine.
Yes, I would just say that it certainly is possible to have various of these youth mobility agreements, and indeed the UK has quietly been extending them, albeit with very small countries. But ultimately, they are still quite bureaucratic. The number of people coming is still relatively low. I mean, the figures I think to the end of 2022 were just shy of 17,000, which in the scheme of sort of 700,000 coming in total is pretty small. It is worth bearing in mind, if you were looking at this entirely as a vector for labour mobility, skilled young people in the EU can choose wherever they want to go. And of course, for them, it's much easier to go to the other 26 states plus the EEA states than it is to come to the UK and face the hurdles. And it must be said, still a sense of hostile environment. And for me, one of the great benefits of having a proper and generous youth mobility scheme, which is not ham-tied in the way that the existing ones are, is to show that we are welcoming to young people and we are genuinely open for business. And of course, cynically, the great advantage about having a youth scheme as opposed to an OAP scheme is that they are young and fit and usually contribute far more than they take out.
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, that's very clear. So thank you. I'll pass back to Peter.
Thank you very much, Alan. Stephen, over to you.
Oh, thank you. Thanks indeed. So question for our witnesses today. What challenges will a UK government face in negotiating reciprocal youth mobility schemes with EU member states? How can the UK best position itself to negotiate these agreements effectively? And I guess it's worth reflecting not just on the UK's extant youth mobility schemes, but also, are there any European, any EU examples? Can we start with you, Catherine?
Yeah, thank you. The principal problem that the UK government's going to face negotiating these schemes country by country is that the member states are under huge pressure from the EU Commission not to do it. Now, this is a political issue dressed up as a legal one. The legal issue is that member states have the legal competence to negotiate these schemes. And so if you just looked at it as a lawyer, you'd say, well, of course, member states can agree to do this. But the Commission doesn't want the states to be negotiating these schemes because they recognise that this is a card that the UK will try to play in any future negotiation of part of the TCA. Just as a small footnote on the renegotiation of the TCA, there's a lot of excitement about the deadline, about the provision in the TCA that says the TCA will be reviewed after 5 years. This is Article 776. But the Commission's line at the moment, i.e. pre any European Parliament elections, is that that's just a review of the implementation. Don't get your hopes up that this is going to be anything more substantive. And indeed, I should just plug UK and Changing Europe report, which basically says that, but a lot more detail than I've just given it. And also, it must be said that the EU thinks they got a very good deal with the TCA. It's not in their interest to renegotiate because they had a trade surplus with us over goods, and they've got an excellent deal with us over goods, not least because, of course, we're not imposing any checks at our borders at the moment. And we had a trade surplus with the EU over services, and we got a very bad deal in respect of that. So the EU is extremely happy. They think the deal's working extremely well from their point of view. They've got very little incentive to negotiate any changes to it. And they're also looking beyond 2029. Because they recognise that even if there is a change of government in 2024-25, UK politics is not very stable at the moment. And if the Conservatives were to get in and it was a Conservative party led by Suella Braverman, then it may be that anything that they make concessions on gets ripped up in a few years after that. So why put the energy into it?
Okay, excellent. Mari?
Thanks. I think that was a pretty good summary of the key challenges from Catherine. I haven't got a huge amount to add, but I think I guess in terms of how the UK could best position itself to negotiate effectively, I mean, given what Catherine said about the kind of the desire for the Commission to kind of have a lead in this, I would have thought focusing and thinking about how to negotiate a broader framework for youth mobility and linking that into kind of a broader discussion around research and cultural exchange within a potentially a revised TCA could then kind of help to unlock potential bilateral negotiations with member states in future. But yeah, I know, as she said, it doesn't sound like that's going to be an easy thing to negotiate, and certainly shouldn't be assumed to be done anytime soon. I guess the hope is that as I mentioned previously, there was in the original draft of the EU discussion of a mobility chapter, and in particular youth exchange, and so it suggests that there's in principle at least an openness from the Commission and the EU to discuss these things.
Okay, interesting. Jonathan?
I mean, I think in the interest of time, I have little to add to what Catherine and Marley said. I agree. This is fundamentally there are a set of interlocked, difficult political issues that need to be unblocked. If those were unblocked, the potential is clearly there.
Okay, it's very interesting. I can't help noticing that there was no reference there to any schemes like this that the EU already does with anybody else. I wonder, Jonathan, do you have any experience of or knowledge of EU?
I'm not aware that that most EU countries do, because of course they have free movement within the EA. I mean, I wouldn't be. I mean, obviously there are sort of ex-colonial ties which lead to bilateral migration flows in de facto. So, the fact is that it's pretty easy to go from Latin America to Spain one way or another. I'm not quite sure whether that reflects formal schemes and so on and so forth, but I'm not aware of any particular schemes.
Okay. Either other witnesses aware of formal schemes that mirror what we have with Australia, New Zealand, India, Iceland, Canada, whatever?
I'm just going to say there are two EU directives. There's a directive on researchers, which allow young PhD and young academics to move, and of course there's also the blue card scheme. So these are much more labour mobility schemes rather than youth mobility schemes, okay. But they're obviously targeted at young people. Now they've been around for some time, but we'd opted out of them, so they never applied to us. But there are particular schemes, and one of the things that the EU thinks at the moment, which is why it's updating its blue card scheme, is that it's losing out in the race with America to attract young talent. So what they're doing is to try and make it much more attractive for third country nationals to come to the EU, and thus, of course, by definition, the member states, via this much more attractive scheme, which not only allows them to come and to work in a university, but also allows them a certain degree of onward mobility, which of course is one of the big issues.
So the reason I ask it is because it goes back to that challenges question, doesn't it? In that they may not be equivalent, but they may provide useful competences. Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, just to say, I think there are individual deals between some EU member states and other countries. So, for instance, look at Canada. Canada has quite a few youth mobility deals with individual countries like Italy and France and so on. So it's definitely possible. As I understand it, those have been with individual EU countries, not with the EU,
not with the EU.
as a whole.
So conceivably, would be breaking new ground to do this.
Yeah, I mean, I defer to Catherine on exactly how this would work, but my understanding would be that given the precedent and given the competence, they'd be more commonly done on an individual member state level, perhaps with the kind of overall framework with the EU under a kind of revised TCA, given what the proposal was from the EU in 2020. But I mean, she probably know better.
Perhaps we should move on to the next question.
Thank you.
Which covers this. Over to you, Jeff.
Thank you very much, Chair. From my side of things, I have to say I'm riveted by the topic because it's one I know incredibly little about. So from my perspective, how do you think youth mobility schemes, the sort of things we're talking about between the UK and the EU member states, could change the UK relationship both with the European Union and possibly even individual European countries? Jonathan?
Sorry, just repeat that last that again.
Yeah, I'm interested in how the sort of youth mobility scheme we're talking about could actually change the UK's relationship, both with the Union and possibly even individual countries.
Well, I mean, I think it goes both ways in a sense, right? First, you have to change yes. First, you have to change the relationship at the top. You have to sort of, and I think Catherine was saying this, you have to restore trust and you have to generate a sort of positive dynamic. And once you've, when you've done that at the very high level, then you can start talking about these things, whether at an EU-wide level or through individual bilateral agreements. And that in turn would, I mean, I think that the sort of bigger picture is here, look, we are geographically part of Europe. Whatever happens, there's going to continue to be a lot of flows of people back and forth. We have 3.5 million EU nationals resident here at the moment, most of whom are going to stay. They are going to continue traveling back and forth, and so they and their families, many of whom are British, will continue traveling back and forth. So it's a question of how you, first of all, set from the top a positive context, and then how you facilitate that and make that as easy and seamless as possible for individuals and their families, in the absence, of us actually rejoining and the single market and reestablishing free movement. And I think, so I think it does come from the top. Getting the dynamics of the relationship right will generate positive feedback, and then you will be able to unblock a lot of the things that make this much more difficult at an individual level, and that in turn will mean that we will hopefully reclaim our rightful place as whether it's as a destination for school groups or as a place where people come here to study and work for a few years and so on, despite the blockers that have been thrown up.
Sorry, Jonathan, I'm sorry to come back to you on that.
No,
just your terminology, the use of the term "from the top." Are we talking about civic society? Are we talking about the political establishment? Are we
talking about? I'm talking about primarily about the political establishment. That is to say, I mean, where we have made our peace with Europe, as it were, where we are not. Where we don't have the sort of headlines that we have today on a completely different topic, where Keir Starmer says some fairly bland things about, oh, well, let's try and deal with the small boats issue by a negotiated agreement with the Euro. And you have very large sections of the government and the right-wing press saying, effectively, this is treason, and what he's trying to do is let the Europeans send us 120,000, quote, illegal migrants, unquote. Where you have a political environment where that sort of discourse is acceptable and common, the fact is that a change of government on its own doesn't solve that, right? If you have the major opposition party taking that line, because the Europeans quite rightly want to have some sort of sense of stability in the relationship. Sorry, I'm straying too far, both off the subject and into more direct politics, but I think you get the idea.
No, and I think that wider context is eminently applicable in this conversation. Catherine, I note the point you've put in the chat. Thank you very much for that. And the last one is au pairing, which has actually been brought up to us before. Just to continue that conversation, Catherine, what do you think about the relationship and where that would go?
Yeah, so I think what I would just say is, I mean, the most appealing relaxation of the current hard lines would be over youth mobility, because it's not anywhere near as toxic as some of the things that Jonathan's just been talking about. But nevertheless, if it doesn't actually deliver that much and very few people come, then it may be sort of gesture politics to try and at least show goodwill. No, of course, that sounds cynical. I'm very much in favour of youth mobility because I've benefited it from myself, and I think it's good for those who take advantage of it. But in preparing for this session this morning, I've looked at quite a lot of youth mobility schemes across the globe, and what's really very striking is just how bureaucratic they are. I looked at, for example, the current scheme which UK nationals can take advantage of to go to Spain, and the volume of paperwork that is required, and it takes at least 90 days to get it sorted, and that you've got to go for an in-person interview as well. And this is just to come for 2 years, not to settle and to work where you can work in a bar. All of this is a very significant disincentive for anyone to actually take advantage of the scheme. And so, in answer to your question, to avoid it just being a pure gesture, we're going to have to offer something which is quite attractive and more attractive than the current arrangements that we have in place.
Thank you very much. That's very useful. Marley?
I haven't got a huge amount to add, but yeah, let's very much support those points.
Thank you very much. That's much appreciated. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you very much, everyone. We're going to start bringing the session to a close now, and we're going to ask each of you for your top picks, policy recommendations in this area. And perhaps we might, in doing so, you might reflect on perhaps the elephant in the room, which is there is a political obsession with absolute numbers as far as immigration is concerned, which seems to get in the way of almost all of these discussions, and what significance or what can be done about that in terms of framing policy recommendations that could actually make a difference. Marley, can I start with you?
Yes, of course. And I think what I'd say in terms of the best approach for seeking youth mobility agreements with the EU countries. I mean, first of all, I think it's important to develop a consistent and comprehensive offer which matches what the UK has offered in other cases such as Australia and New Zealand, and ideally to keep it consistent across member states rather than trying to pick off different states. I think that would go down very badly. Secondly, as I was saying before, I think as Catherine was saying, it's important to engage directly with the Commission on this, and ideally to want to look for some overarching provisions in a revised TCA, which I appreciate may take some time, but it sounds like that might be the best way of unlocking something useful. And then finally, I think it would be helpful to see this as a broader package which combines collaboration on research and universities, cultural exchange with youth mobility. As Catherine noted earlier, there may be less appetite among EU countries for youth mobility in and of itself because they've got free movement within the EU 27. And so being able to access the UK is of perhaps less interest versus our interest in being able to have youth exchange with the EU. And so I think looking at a broader offer and thinking about where the UK really has strong assets and things it can offer, particularly in the context of, for instance, its universities, would be a good way to go to try and seek a beneficial deal. For instance, could it be attached to a broader arrangement with participation as an associate third country in Erasmus? Could an offer be made around university fees for EU citizens? Catherine made the point earlier on ID cards and school children. I think there was a broader package that the UK could offer, which could perhaps unlock progress here. Finally, on your point on net migration, obviously the numbers are very high at the moment, and that is likely to be a somewhat exception. but I'd make just 2 quick points there. First of all, most of the evidence we know is that the public care more about control and managing migration more than the overall numbers. The focus on numbers is actually something that is, I think, is a big focus of the political debate. When you talk to people about this and look at the polling, people tend to be more interested in thinking about having a controlled, well-managed system. Secondly, so I was saying in the context of youth mobility, this is temporary migration. So in the long run, it shouldn't have much of an impact on net migration at all, because people will leave at the end of their visa, whether that's 2 or 3 years.
Thank you very much, Marley. Catherine, would you like to go next?
Yep, 3 things. One, to have a scheme for where anyone in the UK and vice versa can go to the EU for up to 90 days to provide services without having to get a visa, and also crucially to be paid for those services. 2, to have a youth mobility scheme for 3 years. I think the UK should make a generous offer that there will be no restrictions as to area where they can work, because there should be no ballot, and the costs associated with applying for it should be reduced. And thirdly, and building on what Marley's just said, given that we have now agreed to go back into Horizon, at least for this period of what's left of the Horizon term, we should actually, dare I say it, drop all fees and actually allow for something like free movement of those who are participating in the Horizon programme, because one of the reasons why universities such as mine have been hugely successful in getting ERC grants has been because we have been very welcoming to researchers coming in, and we have brought in skill sets that just do not exist in the UK. And the people who've come in, I can give you some concrete examples, that people who came into Cambridge with skills on managing X-raying of certain types of fish, and that training, they were able to train up British people to learn those skills which just do not exist here, which is absolutely crucial for certain types of scientific work.
Very interesting. And do you have a view or recommendation on the definition of youth?
I would make youth young, but not too young. I'd go up to 35 at least, and particularly joking apart, bearing in mind that the generations that are coming through have been badly affected by COVID, and things that would have been done at a younger age in the past are now being done at an older age. We see this with the students, that the students who are starting as freshers are much less well equipped to start university than their predecessors 5 years before. And so I would absolutely make youth up to at least 35.
That's a very, very interesting point. Yeah, thank you very much, Catherine. And finally, Jonathan.
Not much to add. I agree with Catherine. Part of the as part of the TCA negotiations, a business visa or whatever you want to call it to allow people to move short term, that's very much a trade issue. On the broader point, I would make this, as Marley said, part of a sort of wider sort of cultural, social convention, and separate and make clear this is not about immigration. It's about the exchange of people and ideas to embed us back in Europe as part of a cultural, social and cultural entity, even if we remain outside as a political entity. I think can we go up to 57 for youth?
I was going to suggest 68, but
yes, I'm sorry, I have to go now because I have another panel at 12, but thank you.
Thank you so much for your input, Jonathan. Okay. Very valuable. Thank you. All right. Well, and Catherine and Marley, thank you so much as well for your input. It's been a very interesting session. I guess one of the big questions it begs is whether there'll be a willing ear in Brussels to any of the suggestions that may eventually be made in this area, and I'm not overly optimistic about that, but hopefully wrong. Anyway, thank you very much indeed for your contribution, and look forward to putting all of this into our further thinking on policy recommendations. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much for inviting us. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.